Some names open doors. Others make entire rooms forget how to breathe. Rain painted silver streaks across the towering glass windows of the Blackstone Grand Hotel as Manhattan glowed beneath the storm like a city wrapped in liquid gold. Inside the Imperial Ballroom, power moved quietly. Billionaires shook hands beside marble columns. Senators laughed beneath crystal chandeliers worth more than most American homes. Waiters in black uniforms drifted silently between tables carrying champagne that cost $400 a bottle while a string quartet played somewhere beneath the low murmur of old money pretending not to stare at itself. Above the ballroom entrance hung a wall of engraved brass plates honoring the donors responsible for building St. Aurora Children's Hospital, one of the most prestigious pediatric centers on the East Coast. Names mattered here. Legacy mattered more. Claire Whitmore moved through the crowd like she had learned long ago how to disappear. At 26, she wore her blonde hair pinned into a clean low bun beneath the ballroom lights, her expression calm, unreadable, almost detached. The white cuffs of her uniform were perfectly pressed despite the chaos around her. She balanced a silver tray effortlessly through clusters of wealthy guests discussing hedge funds, political campaigns, and private islands as if none of it carried any real weight. Most people never looked directly at her. That was the strange thing about luxury. The richer the room became, the more invisible the people serving inside it seemed to become. "Careful around table 14, another waitress whispered while passing beside her. "That's Damien Holloway." Claire nodded once. No reaction. No curiosity. Just quiet understanding. Everyone in New York knew Damien Holloway. CEO of Holloway Capital. Ruthless negotiator. Financial television loved him because he spoke like a man permanently disappointed in humanity. At 44, he carried himself with the cold precision of someone used to controlling every room he entered. Tonight he sat beneath the glow of chandelier light wearing a midnight black tuxedo and a silver Patek Philippe that flashed every time he lifted his champagne glass. Around him sat investors, politicians, and board members laughing a little too hard at his jokes. People always laughed harder around powerful men. Claire approached the table with a fresh bottle of Bordeaux resting against her palm. "Good evening, sir," she said softly. "Your 1989 Chateau Margaux." Damien barely glanced at her. "You're late." His voice wasn't loud, but conversations nearby seemed to dim anyway. Claire checked the label calmly before pouring. "My apologies, sir." Damien watched the glass fill halfway. "You people always say that like it means something." A few guests smiled awkwardly into their drinks. Claire remained composed. "Would you prefer a replacement bottle?" "I'd prefer competence." He lifted the wine, studied its color beneath the light, then looked directly at her for the first time. His blue eyes were sharp, clinical, almost bored. "What's your name?" "Claire, sir." "Claire what?" "Whitmore." The moment lasted less than a second. But something shifted. Damien's fingers stopped against the stem of the glass. Across the table, an older man in a navy tuxedo looked up immediately. Another guest turned slightly in her chair. Claire noticed it all without appearing to notice anything. Damien recovered first. "Whitmore," he repeated slowly, as if testing the sound against an old memory. Then he gave a faint dismissive smile. "Well, Claire Whitmore, maybe tonight you can try not to embarrass yourself in front of people whose names actually matter." Soft laughter circled the table. Not cruel enough to sound cruel. Just enough to wound quietly. Claire lowered her eyes politely. "Of course, sir." But near the ballroom entrance, beneath the gold donor wall glowing under chandelier light, a grey-haired man had gone completely pale staring at the name stitched onto her uniform. The grey-haired man near the donor wall lowered his champagne glass slowly, his eyes never leaving Claire as she disappeared back into the moving current of servers and guests. His name was Theodore Ashcombe, chairman of the St. Aurora Foundation Board, and for the first time in nearly 20 years, he looked genuinely shaken. Around him, the gala continued with polished elegance. Crystal clinked softly beneath chandelier light. A jazz pianist replaced the quartet near the ballroom balcony. Waiters circulated carrying miniature crab cakes and smoked fillet sliders on silver trays while Manhattan rain traced silver rivers against the towering windows. But Theodore no longer heard any of it. Because there were certain names in New York that belonged to history. Whitmore was one of them. Claire stepped through the service corridor toward the kitchen, the warmth of the ballroom fading behind heavy double doors. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Here there were no diamonds, no speeches, no cameras. Only steam, sharp voices, and exhausted staff moving beneath fluorescent lights that made everyone look older. "What happened out there?" another server whispered while stacking plates beside her. "Nothing," Claire answered calmly. "Holloway happened," the woman muttered. "That man could insult sunshine." Claire gave the faintest smile but said nothing. She reached for another tray as the kitchen manager shouted table numbers across the line. Around her, the machinery of luxury continued turning. Perfect dinners. Perfect timing. Perfect invisibility. But deep down, beneath the practiced calm she carried like armor, Damien Holloway's words lingered longer than she wanted them to. Not because they were unique. She had heard versions of them before from men who measured human value through bank accounts and dinner reservations. What unsettled her was the way he paused after hearing her last name. As if somewhere beneath the arrogance, recognition had flickered for a moment before disappearing again. Back inside the ballroom, Damien leaned back in his chair while investors around him discussed acquisition strategies and tax positioning for the upcoming fiscal year. Yet his attention drifted repeatedly toward the ballroom entrance. "You are distracted tonight," one board member observed with a laugh. Damien swirled the Bordeaux slowly. "Just tired." But he was not tired. He was irritated. Irritated because the surname Whitmore had unlocked something buried in memory. A conversation years ago. A hospital wing. An old woman with silver hair standing beside his late father during a fundraiser in Boston. Eleanor Whitmore. Even now, decades later, powerful people still spoke her name carefully. She had built charitable foundations across 3 states without ever attaching her face to magazine covers or television interviews. Old money. Quiet money. The kind that did not need attention to prove it existed. Damien frowned faintly. Impossible. Eleanor Whitmore had no public heirs. At least none anyone important had ever met. His assistant leaned toward him discreetly. "Sir, Channel 8 wants a quick interview before the keynote speech." Damien nodded once, but before standing, his eyes drifted again across the ballroom. Claire had returned carrying a tray of champagne flutes. She moved carefully through the crowd with the same composed silence that somehow irritated him even more. Most people reacted to power. They became nervous, eager, intimidated. Claire Whitmore simply absorbed humiliation without expression, and somehow that felt less like weakness and more like distance. As if none of this truly touched her. Near the stage, Theodore Ashcombe finally approached one of the senior foundation directors. "Find out who hired that waitress," he said quietly. "Tonight." The director blinked in confusion. "The blonde woman." Theodore's eyes remained fixed on Claire across the ballroom. "Yes," he answered softly. "Because if I am right about who she is, then half the people in this room have no idea they are standing beside the most important person here." By 9:15, the ballroom had transformed into the version of New York most Americans only saw in magazines. The stage lights glowed soft amber against velvet curtains embroidered with the Saint Aurora crest while waiters moved silently between tables carrying espresso, aged whiskey, and desserts plated like museum pieces. Outside, the rain had intensified, turning the windows into blurred mirrors reflecting diamonds, candlelight, and ambition. Claire adjusted the silver tray against her palm as she crossed behind the donor tables. Her feet ached beneath the polished black shoes required by hotel management, but her expression never changed. She had mastered that years ago. Calm was easier than explanation. Across the room, Damien Holloway stood near the stage surrounded by cameras and reporters. Even under warm chandelier light, there was something cold about him. He answered questions with clipped precision while executives nearby watched him carefully, like men standing close to expensive machinery they respected but did not entirely trust. Saint Aurora represents the future of pediatric innovation, Damien said smoothly into a microphone. This city has a responsibility to invest in children before tragedy forces us to care. Applause followed instantly. Practiced. Polished. Claire continued walking without looking up. But as she passed behind the press line, one reporter accidentally stepped backward into her path. The edge of the tray tilted. A single champagne flute slid sideways and shattered against the marble floor beside the stage. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a snapped wire. Conversation stopped. Cameras turned instinctively. Claire froze only for a fraction of a second before lowering herself calmly to gather the broken glass. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. The reporter apologized immediately, embarrassed. But Damien looked down at the scattered champagne spreading across the marble and exhaled sharply through his nose. Irritation flashed across his face with dangerous speed. "Of course," he muttered loud enough for nearby guests to hear. Because apparently competence was too much to ask for tonight. The ballroom tightened around the words. Claire continued picking up the broken pieces carefully. "Sir, the accident was not her fault," the reporter tried to explain. Damien barely acknowledged him. "It becomes her fault the second she is standing here unprepared." Several cameras were still recording. Claire rose slowly with the empty tray balanced against one hand. Tiny droplets of champagne clung to the cuff of her white sleeve beneath the chandelier glow. Damien studied her with visible annoyance, and perhaps something else beneath it now. Curiosity. Suspicion. "Do you know how much this floor costs to maintain?" he asked coldly. Claire met his eyes for the first time since earlier that evening. "No, sir. More than most people earn in 5 years." Silence spread outward through the nearby tables. A few guests shifted uncomfortably. Others pretended not to listen while listening to every word. Damien straightened the cuff of his tuxedo calmly. "People spend their entire lives trying to enter rooms like this," he continued. "The least they can do is respect them once they get inside." Claire lowered her gaze again, but there was no shame in her posture. Only restraint. "I understand." Her calmness somehow irritated him more. Before Damien could respond, Theodore Ashcombe appeared beside the stage with unusual urgency in his expression. "Damien," he interrupted carefully, "perhaps we should move toward the keynote presentation." Damien glanced at him briefly. "One moment." Theodore's eyes shifted toward Claire, then back toward Damien with growing concern. "I really do not think this is necessary." But Damien was already looking at the stitched name on Claire's uniform again. Whitmore. The surname seemed heavier now somehow. Older. Dangerous in ways he could not yet explain. "Tell me something," Damien said quietly. "Who exactly are you?" Around them, the ballroom had gone nearly silent except for the distant sound of rain striking the glass high above Manhattan. The silence that settled over the ballroom felt heavier than the rain outside. Hundreds of eyes drifted between Damien Holloway and the young waitress standing beneath the stage lights with champagne still glistening against the cuff of her sleeve. Somewhere near the back of the room, silverware touched porcelain with a faint metallic sound before disappearing again into stillness. Claire held the empty tray against her side calmly. No defensiveness. No fear. Just quiet restraint. Damien studied her expression with growing frustration. Most people folded beneath pressure. They apologized too quickly, explained too much, or tried desperately to regain favor. Claire Whitmore simply stood there as if his opinion carried far less weight than he expected it to. "Well?" Damien asked finally. "You heard the question." Claire looked toward him evenly. "I am a waitress working tonight's event, sir." A few nervous laughs flickered around nearby tables, but Damien did not smile. Theodore Ashcombe stepped closer, lowering his voice carefully. "Damien, the keynote begins in less than 5 minutes. Then they can wait." Damien's tone remained controlled, but irritation sharpened beneath it now. I would simply like to understand why everyone suddenly looks terrified over a last name. Theodore hesitated. For the first time in years, the chairman of the St. Aurora Foundation appeared genuinely uncertain. Across the ballroom, several older donors had begun whispering quietly among themselves. One woman near the donor wall stared openly at Claire now, her hand pressed lightly against her necklace as if she had seen a ghost. Damien noticed all of it. The atmosphere had shifted completely. Not because of spilled champagne. Because of her. Claire lowered her eyes briefly toward the marble floor before speaking again. The gala should continue, sir. People are here for the hospital. Her voice was soft, almost gentle, but something about the sentence unsettled Damien more than anger would have. It sounded less like submission and more like disappointment. A young producer from Channel 8 edged closer with a camera operator, sensing tension worth capturing. Damien glanced toward them, then back toward Claire. Interesting, he said coolly. You spend the evening serving drinks, yet suddenly everyone acts like you belong on the donor wall instead. Theodore inhaled sharply. Damien. But Damien continued. Do you know what charity events like this actually are? He gestured toward the ballroom around them. They are built by people who sacrifice decades building companies, employing thousands, creating institutions that survive long after they are gone. Not by waitresses carrying trays. Claire remained silent. Damien took a slow step closer beneath the chandelier light. Names matter in this city because people earn them. Legacy is not some costume people wear because it sounds impressive. The camera nearby continued recording quietly. Claire noticed it immediately. So did Theodore. That is enough, Theodore warned softly. But Damien's frustration had already carried him too far forward to stop gracefully now. No, he replied without looking away from Claire. I would genuinely like to know why the room changes every time someone says Whitmore. He folded one hand into his pocket calmly. Because unless I miss something, the only contribution you have made tonight is broken glass. The words landed harder than he intended. Even the investors behind him shifted uncomfortably now. Claire looked at him for several seconds without speaking. Then, very slowly, she placed the empty silver tray onto a nearby service table. Her movements remained precise and calm beneath the golden ballroom light. My grandmother used to say something similar, she said quietly. Damien frowned slightly. Excuse me. Claire met his eyes fully for the first time that evening. She said people often confuse visibility with value. Somewhere behind them, a champagne glass slipped from someone's hand and shattered softly against the marble floor. The second glass shattered somewhere behind the donor tables, and the sound seemed to break the invisible spell hanging over the ballroom. Conversations restarted in low uneasy murmurs while reporters exchanged glances sharp with curiosity. Damien Holloway remained perfectly still beneath the chandelier light, but something behind his expression had changed. Claire's words had landed somewhere deeper than he wanted to admit. People often confuse visibility with value. The sentence lingered in his mind with irritating precision. Theodore Ashcombe stepped forward immediately, forcing a diplomatic smile toward the nearby cameras. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced carefully, if everyone would please direct their attention toward the stage, we will begin tonight's keynote presentation. Slowly, reluctantly, attention shifted away from the confrontation. Guests returned to their seats. The jazz pianist resumed playing softly near the balcony. Waiters moved again through the aisles carrying fresh glasses as if the evening could still return to normal. But normal was already gone. Claire bent calmly to retrieve another tray from the service table. Miss Whitmore, Theodore said quietly before she could leave. She paused. Up close, his expression carried something almost paternal now. Concern mixed with disbelief. May I speak with you privately for a moment? Claire's eye softened slightly. Not tonight, Theodore. Damien noticed the familiarity immediately. Theodore noticed that Damien noticed it. The chairman cleared his throat softly. Claire, people have been searching for you for years. Damien stared at her sharply. Claire gave the faintest shake of her head. No, she answered gently. People have been searching for a story. That is different. Without another word, she turned and disappeared into the moving crowd of servers beneath the ballroom lights. Damien watched her go longer than necessary. What exactly is happening here? He asked finally. Theodore looked tired suddenly. Older than he had an hour ago. You truly do not know. Know what? Theodore glanced toward the massive donor wall near the ballroom entrance where polished brass plaques reflected golden light across the marble floor. At the very center, engraved larger than all the others, stood one name. Eleanor Whitmore. Damien followed his gaze. Everyone knows who Eleanor Whitmore was. Theodore looked back toward him carefully. Do they? The question unsettled Damien more than it should have. Across the room, Claire entered the service corridor again, finally allowing herself one slow breath away from the cameras and attention. The kitchen remained loud with orders and steam, but even here whispers had started spreading. Several employees stopped talking when she passed. Others stared openly now. One young server approached cautiously. Claire, is it true? Claire picked up a fresh tray without looking up. Is what true? That you are related to Eleanor Whitmore. Claire adjusted the folded linen napkins carefully beside the champagne glasses. I am related to myself, she answered quietly. That is usually complicated enough. The server blinked in confusion as Claire walked away again. Back inside the ballroom, Damien moved toward the donor wall almost unconsciously. Rainwater streaked the towering windows nearby while flashes of lightning illuminated Manhattan far below. He stood before Eleanor Whitmore's plaque in silence. Beneath the engraved name were the words founding benefactor. Lifetime endowment, confidential. Damien frowned faintly. Most donors advertised every dollar they gave away. Confidential donations of that size were almost unheard of. Theodore joined him quietly. Your father admired her very much, he said. Damien kept his eyes on the plaque. He mentioned her once or twice. Theodore gave a quiet, humorless laugh. Your father nearly lost Holloway Capital in 1998. Eleanor Whitmore quietly financed the restructuring herself. Damien turned sharply toward him. What? No press release. No interviews. No public recognition. She saved the company and told no one because she believed dignity mattered more than applause. Theodore's eyes drifted toward the ballroom where Claire moved silently between tables again beneath the chandelier glow. The frightening thing, he said softly, is that Claire reminds me of her almost exactly. The keynote speech began at exactly 9:30 beneath warm golden lights that softened the edges of the enormous ballroom, but Damien Holloway barely heard a word of it. Applause rose and fell around him while executives nodded through rehearsed speeches about innovation, compassion, and the future of pediatric medicine. Yet his attention drifted repeatedly toward the moving figure in the black waitress uniform crossing between tables with careful precision. Claire Whitmore no longer looked ordinary to him. That was the problem. Once a person changed shape in your mind, it became impossible to force them back into the role you first assigned them. Damien loosened the cuff of his tuxedo slightly and leaned toward his assistant seated beside him. Find everything you can on Claire Whitmore, he said quietly. The assistant blinked once in surprise. Tonight. Now. No further explanation was needed. Within seconds, discreet messages moved silently across phones beneath linen-covered tables while the Gala continued sparkling around them. Rain hammered softly against the towering windows overlooking Park Avenue. Candlelight flickered against crystal glasses. Somewhere near the balcony, the jazz pianist transitioned into a slower melody that seemed to wrap around the ballroom like smoke. Claire moved through it all untouched, collecting empty plates with the same calm rhythm she had maintained all evening. But she could feel the shift now. People looked at her differently. Donors who previously ignored her suddenly paused when she approached their tables. A woman in diamonds thanked her twice for refilling water. One elderly board member stood awkwardly when she passed, as if uncertain whether he should. Claire hated it immediately. Visibility was exhausting. In the service hallway behind the ballroom, she stopped briefly beside a narrow window streaked with rain. Manhattan glowed below like scattered gold beneath storm clouds. For a moment, she allowed herself stillness. Then her phone vibrated once inside her apron pocket. She glanced down at the screen. 3 missed calls. All from unknown numbers connected to the Foundation offices. Claire closed her eyes briefly before silencing the phone again. Across the ballroom, Damien's assistant returned faster than expected, his expression visibly unsettled. "Sir," he said quietly, lowering his voice further, "there is almost nothing public on her." Damien frowned. "That is impossible. No social media. No interviews. No financial filings under her direct name. It is like someone intentionally erased her footprint." Damien's irritation deepened. "Keep looking." The assistant hesitated. "There is one thing." Damien lifted his eyes slowly. "What?" The assistant swallowed carefully. Claire Whitmore was listed 3 years ago as a silent trustee connected to the Eleanor Whitmore Pediatric Endowment. Damien stared at him. "That foundation controls St. Aurora?" "Yes, sir." Damien's gaze drifted instinctively toward the massive donor wall again. The realization unsettled him in ways he could not explain. He had spent 20 years building influence in rooms exactly like this one. Yet somehow the quiet waitress he publicly humiliated possessed deeper roots here than he did. Near the stage, Theodore Ashcombe watched Damien carefully from across the ballroom. He recognized the expression forming behind the CEO's calm exterior. It was not fear exactly. Men like Damien Holloway rarely experienced fear openly. It was something worse. The beginning of perspective. Suddenly the ballroom lights dimmed slightly as the keynote presentation reached its final segment. A large projection screen descended behind the stage displaying images of St. Aurora Children's Hospital. Smiling nurses. Families. Recovery rooms built through donor funding. Soft applause moved through the audience again. Then the presenter's voice echoed gently through the ballroom speakers. "Before we conclude tonight," she announced warmly, "the Foundation would like to recognize one anonymous contributor whose support quietly funded the entire expansion of our new pediatric cardiac wing." Damien looked up absent-mindedly at first. But Theodore Ashcombe had already gone pale beside the stage. Because for the first time all evening, Claire Whitmore stopped moving. The ballroom lights softened further until the enormous crystal chandeliers above looked almost suspended in darkness like floating constellations. Every table turned toward the stage as photographs of St. Aurora Children's Hospital glowed across the projection screen. Children laughing in recovery rooms. Nurses embracing exhausted parents. Hallways filled with warm morning sunlight. The entire evening had been carefully designed to inspire generosity, but suddenly the atmosphere no longer felt performative. It felt personal. Claire stood motionless near the west service aisle with a silver tray balanced lightly against her fingertips. Around her, waiters continued moving between tables, but more slowly now, as if even they sensed something shifting beneath the polished surface of the gala. On stage, the Foundation presenter smiled warmly into the microphone. "For years," she said softly, "this donor requested complete anonymity. No interviews. No publicity. No naming rights. Only one condition." The ballroom remained silent except for rain whispering against the tall windows overlooking Manhattan. Damien Holloway watched the stage carefully now, unease tightening quietly beneath his ribs. Theodore Ashcombe had not moved from his place near the donor wall. His expression carried the tension of a man watching history walk toward him in slow motion. The condition, the presenter continued, was that every child receiving treatment inside the cardiac wing would receive care regardless of their family's financial situation. A murmur spread through the ballroom. Even among billionaires, that level of unrestricted funding was rare. Damien felt something cold settle into his stomach. His assistant leaned closer again. "Sir," he whispered carefully, "the Whitmore Endowment funded nearly 70% of St. Aurora's expansion over the past decade." Damien turned slowly toward him. Why was none of this public? Apparently the donor refused public disclosure. The presenter smiled gently beneath the stage lights. Tonight, after many years, the Foundation Board was finally granted permission to acknowledge the individual responsible. Claire closed her eyes briefly. Just for a second. As if bracing herself against something she had spent years avoiding. Theodore Ashcombe lowered his head. "Oh, Claire," he murmured softly to himself. "You should have stayed hidden." Then the projection screen changed. A black and white photograph appeared high above the ballroom. An elegant silver-haired woman stood beside a children's hospital bed smiling quietly at a young patient. Beneath the image appeared a single name. Eleanor Whitmore. The reaction inside the ballroom was immediate. Older donors straightened in their seats. Several executives exchanged stunned glances. One woman near the front covered her mouth entirely. Eleanor Whitmore was not merely respected in New York philanthropy. She was legendary. Before her passing, the presenter continued, Eleanor Whitmore entrusted the continuation of her foundation to someone she believed shared her deepest values. Someone she described as kind when no one was watching. Damien's heartbeat slowed heavily in his chest now. Somewhere deep inside him, the shape of the truth had already formed before the words arrived. The presenter turned gently toward the west side of the ballroom. Toward Claire. "Miss Claire Whitmore," she said softly into the microphone, "would you please join us on stage?" Silence. Complete and absolute. Every head turned at once. Claire remained standing beside the service aisle in her black waitress uniform beneath hundreds of stunned eyes. Damien stared at her as if seeing her clearly for the first time all evening. Not invisible. Not ordinary. Not small. Theodore Ashcombe began applauding first. Slowly. Reverently. Then others joined him. One table. Then another. The sound spread outward through the ballroom until the entire gala rose into a standing ovation around the woman Damien Holloway had publicly humiliated less than 30 minutes earlier. Claire looked almost uncomfortable beneath the attention. She set the silver tray down carefully onto a nearby table before walking toward the stage with calm, measured steps. No triumph. No arrogance. Just quiet dignity beneath the chandelier light. Damien remained frozen beside the donor wall while applause thundered around him. And for the first time in many years, the most powerful man in the room understood exactly what powerlessness felt like. The applause continued long after Claire Whitmore stepped onto the stage, but she never reacted the way people expected powerful individuals to react. She did not wave. She did not smile for the cameras. She simply stood beneath the amber lights in her black waitress uniform while the ballroom rose around her in stunned admiration. The contrast itself was almost unbearable to watch. Men wearing watches worth $200,000 stood clapping for a woman whose sleeves still carried faint traces of spilled champagne from serving their tables less than an hour earlier. Claire accepted the microphone only after the applause softened into silence again. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice carried across the ballroom with remarkable calm. "But tonight was never supposed to be about me." Even the reporters near the stage lowered their cameras slightly as she spoke. There was no performance in her tone. No hunger for recognition. That alone made her impossible to ignore. Damien Holloway remained near the donor wall, unable to move. Around him, executives whispered in low disbelief while board members glanced toward him with expressions that shifted rapidly from sympathy to discomfort. The cameras that once captured his polished confidence now kept drifting back toward Claire instead. For the first time in years, Damien felt invisible in a room he normally controlled effortlessly. Claire continued softly. "My grandmother believed hospitals should feel less like monuments and more like promises. Promises that people would not be abandoned simply because they were frightened, or poor, or alone." Theodore Ashcombe lowered his eyes beside the stage, visibly emotional now. Claire glanced briefly toward the projection screen displaying Eleanor Whitmore's photograph. She spent her entire life trying to help quietly because she believed kindness loses meaning once it becomes performance. The sentence landed directly inside Damien's chest like truth spoken too plainly to avoid. He remembered every camera interview he had ever given. Every oversized donation check. Every headline praising Holloway Capital for charitable leadership. Suddenly all of it felt strangely loud. Claire's gaze drifted slowly across the ballroom until, finally, it settled on Damien. The room itself seemed to tighten around the moment. "And she taught me something else," Claire said gently. "The easiest time to respect someone is when they are important. The hardest time is when they appear ordinary." Silence spread outward through the ballroom again. No accusation. No cruelty. Somehow that made it worse. Damien felt heat rise slowly beneath his collar despite the cool air conditioning flowing through the ballroom. He was accustomed to enemies fighting back loudly. He understood anger. Lawsuits. Negotiations. Public attacks. But Claire Whitmore was not humiliating him. She was simply standing there with dignity so complete that his own behavior collapsed beside it naturally. Theodore stepped toward the microphone carefully. "Claire has quietly overseen the Whitmore Pediatric Endowment for the last 6 years," he announced. Audible gasps spread across several tables. Under her leadership, St. Aurora has expanded treatment access across 3 states and funded more than 18,000 pediatric surgeries. Damien stared at Claire in disbelief. 18,000 children. Quietly. Without interviews. Without recognition. Without attaching her name to every wall in the building. Suddenly the memory of his own voice earlier that evening returned with brutal clarity. "The only contribution you have made tonight is broken glass." He felt physically ill. Claire handed the microphone back to Theodore gently. "Please continue the gala," she said softly. "The children deserve more attention than I do." Then she stepped away from the stage beneath absolute silence. Not dramatic silence. Reverent silence. The kind that appears only when an entire room realizes it misunderstood someone completely. As Claire descended the stage stairs, Damien instinctively stepped forward as if to stop her, but the words never came. Because for the first time in a very long time, Damien Holloway understood something terrifying. Money could purchase admiration. Fear could command obedience. Influence could control headlines. But none of those things could manufacture grace. And standing beneath the chandelier light watching Claire Whitmore walk past him without anger, he realized grace was the one form of power he had never learned how to buy. By the time the gala finally began winding down, Manhattan had disappeared behind sheets of midnight rain. The Blackstone Grand Hotel glowed against the storm like a ship floating alone in darkness while chauffeurs lined the curb outside beneath umbrellas and flashing headlights. Inside the ballroom, the atmosphere had changed completely. Conversations had softened. Laughter carried less arrogance now. Even the executives from Holloway Capital seemed strangely subdued as they gathered coats and exchanged careful goodnights beneath the fading chandelier light. Claire Whitmore stood alone near the service corridor, removing the white apron from her uniform with slow, deliberate movements. The ballroom staff around her moved quietly, still uncertain how to speak to her after what they had witnessed. One young waiter finally approached with visible hesitation. "Miss Whitmore," he said softly, "I just wanted to say, what you did for those kids." Claire looked up gently. "I did not do it alone." "Still," he replied awkwardly, "people like you do not usually work events like this." Claire folded the apron neatly over one arm. "People like me?" The young waiter immediately looked embarrassed. "I did not mean," Claire offered him a small reassuring smile. "I know." Then she stepped past him toward the hotel exit while the distant sound of jazz piano faded behind her. Outside, cold rain swept across the Manhattan sidewalks in silver waves beneath the city lights. Black SUVs idled beside the entrance while reporters still lingered beneath awnings hoping for one final photograph or statement. Claire ignored them completely. She pulled on a long charcoal coat and stepped beneath the hotel canopy just as a familiar voice stopped her. "Claire." She turned slowly. Damien Holloway stood several feet away beneath the rain-darkened glow of the entrance lights. Without the ballroom crowd surrounding him, he looked older somehow. Less untouchable. The storm reflected across the polished black surface of his car while droplets of rain clung to the shoulders of his tuxedo. For a moment neither of them spoke. Manhattan traffic hissed through wet streets nearby. Finally Damien exhaled quietly. "I owe you an apology." Claire studied him calmly. "You do?" The honesty of the answer almost made him smile despite himself. "I spent my entire career believing I could measure people within 5 minutes of meeting them," he admitted. Tonight proved otherwise. Claire looked out toward the rain falling across Park Avenue. "Most people only see what confirms what they already believe." Damien nodded slowly. "And what do you believe?" Claire was quiet for several seconds before answering. "I believe pain makes some people kinder." Her eye shifted toward him gently. "And it makes others louder." The word settled between them softly beneath the rain. Damien lowered his gaze for the first time all evening. Somewhere behind them, hotel staff rolled silver carts through the marble lobby while the last gala guests disappeared into waiting cars. The city itself seemed quieter now. Smaller somehow. "The hospital wing," Damien said carefully. 18,000 surgeries. Why keep it anonymous? Claire looked back toward the ballroom windows glowing high above the street. Because children needing heart surgery should never become someone else's publicity campaign. Damien felt the truth of that sentence with painful clarity. Every charitable event he had ever attended suddenly felt hollow beside her quiet sincerity. Claire stepped toward the curb where a simple black town car waited beneath the rain. Before opening the door, she paused one final time. "My grandmother used to say something interesting about powerful men," she said softly. Damien looked at her. "What was that?" Claire's expression remained calm beneath the silver Manhattan rain. She said the strongest people in the room are usually the ones who never need the room to know it. Then she entered the car and disappeared into the stormlit city without another word. Damien remained standing beneath the hotel canopy long after the taillights vanished into traffic. Around him, New York still glittered with wealth, ambition, and noise. But for the first time in many years, none of it felt impressive.